All right, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining. My name is Nadine Bayer. I'm the Academy and Manager at A4S, and thank you for joining us today on Transform Your Decisions, Management Information. Information drives decisions, and better information results in better decisions. And whilst traditional accounting methodologies focus on monitoring and reporting on financial capital within their management information practices, there's a need for businesses to refocus the lens of their reporting, to de-risk the organization, and to ensure that there's a focus on wider stakeholder value and not just enterprise value. Providing useful information to business leaders and wider stakeholders can help to inform decision-making and ensure that business decisions are made with wider strategic objectives in mind, rather than focusing on short-term financial flows. Our session today will focus on how to practically implement changes needed to refocus management reporting and management information towards a more integrated approach. An integrated approach takes into account value creation for environment and society, as well as for shareholders. And we will also touch on key challenges that you may face within your own organization and how to overcome these. These A4S monthly webinars are part of the A4S Academy program and are open to non-participants. And in case you're interested in learning more about the Academy program and how you or a colleague of yours can apply, please have a look at the follow-up resources email we will send out directly after this webinar. As you may have noticed, we're recording this webinar, and it will be made available on the A4S YouTube channel afterwards and will also be circulated via email. In terms of what we're doing today, so we will start with a short introduction to integrated management information, and then we will have a panel discussion with our three panelists to understand ways of integrating environmental and social considerations into management information processes. This will be followed with a Q&A from the audience, and then we will finish with a wrap-up. You can ask questions freely in the chat function throughout the whole webinar, and we will try to address these as part of the Q&A. We will also be asking you questions about the content covered throughout the webinar using Zoom poll questions. And you will need to complete these in order to get your CPD and CPE points. So please don't forget to participate. After today's webinar, we think you will be able to communicate the business benefits of integrating sustainability information into your management information reporting systems, describe the steps to develop an integrated management information framework, and translate the experience and learnings of others through practical examples to your work. And I'm very pleased to introduce you to today's guest speakers. With us today are Hendrik Rosenthal, Director for Group Sustainability at CLP. The CLP Group is one of the largest investor-owned power businesses in Asia Pacific. The business spans every major sector of the electricity value chain, including retail, transmission, and distribution, along with a diversified portfolio of generation assets. Hendrik is responsible for CLP's group sustainability-related strategy, reporting, and communications to support the company in running as a leading responsible energy provider in the Asia-Pacific region. Then we also have with us today Chris Moreton, Assistant Director of Commissioning and Value at the National Collaborative Commissioning Unit at NHS Wales. Chris leads the value-based strategy for commissioning ambulance services in Wales and commercial finance for 2 national contracts delivering independent sector mental health and learning disability services. Chris also worked with A4S to develop the Essential Guide to Management Information whilst working with Deloitte, and is now implementing the principles of that guide within his role as NHS Wales. And with us today is also Joanne Henstock, Executive Director at A4S. Joanne brings with her a wealth of experience from her previous role as Executive Director of Governance, Integrated Reporting, and Sustainability at EY Africa, and will share her insights into the role of management information with us today. The panel discussion with these three panelists will be shared by Helen Wayne, Senior Manager for Sustainability and Accounting at A4S. So before I hand over to Helen, I would like to find out a bit about where you are in your organizational sustainability journey. Take a moment to consider, how would you describe your organization's positioning when it comes to sustainability? Are you just starting out? Are you middling? Or are you advanced? And to capture your assessment of where you say your organization is, we will run a short poll. Interesting. It's great to see some of these responses coming in, to see where you are on your journey. Many of you consider yourself in the pack, in the middle, very few advanced, very few just starting out. Sometimes it can be the case that organizations tend to overestimate where they are with regard to integrate management information. So setting the scene with regard to positioning where your organization actually is a useful exercise to outline the path forward. And I will now hand over to Helen to talk you through what this means in detail and in practice. Thank you.
Thanks, Nadine. So as Nadine mentioned, we have the honour to speak with Hendrik, Chris and Joanne today, who'll share their insights with us. Welcome all, and thank you so much for joining us. So Joanne, just to kick off, we've spoken before about the importance of understanding where an organisation is on its sustainability journey and how that could impact upon the actions required. I wonder if you could give us your view on this and also what an IMI really is seeking to achieve.
Thanks, Helen. I think it's a really important question because if organizations do their maturity assessment correctly, they are able to position themselves well for the advancements and the enhancements they need to make to their management information systems to actually position them correctly and well to engage on material sustainability issues in the organization and with external stakeholders. So if you get the maturity assessment wrong, you're going to sacrifice the opportunity to make the deep substantive changes to the management information system that are going to charge the organization forward and help the organization keep pace with stakeholder and investor expectations and its peer group, its sector peer group. So it's very important to be brutally honest in doing these assessments. We find many organizations in practice will default to think, well, we must be middle of the pack. We can't be just starting out. We must be middling of the pack. And as Nadine said, often that's an overestimation. If you really go and have a look at, peel back the tent flap and have a look, often it's really far less mature. So I suppose my point is that being brutally honest so that you can position yourself to make the correct changes, to get better at integrating sustainability. That's a key sort of first step. And of course, it is human behaviors that are involved. Often the current incumbents in the sustainability roles may feel somewhat defensive about a maturity assessment. That's just normal human behavior. So it's important to do the maturity assessment in a safe environment, an environment where no one feels threatened or needs to be defensive. Because the emphasis is on moving forward, not on looking back. And so it's very important to engage, the incumbents in the sustainability sort of arm of the organization and ensure that they're able to be honest and, make their requests on what needs to happen to be more mature and to make those requests without, fear of reprisal or blowback or anything like that. So it is a tricky thing to do, but it's important to do it well. Thanks for your question, Helen.
Thanks, Joanne. That's a really useful insight. And just to give a bit of a background on IMI. So IMI really seeks to achieve good quality information, which is relevant and reliable, that incorporates sustainability as well as financial information. The information needs to be decision useful for internal and external users. And it's really helpful to ensure that this kind of fits within the wider reporting demands and processes. Adjusting IMI in this way helps to kind of focus on that long-term value creation. So looking at not just financial value, but also the societal and environmental value, rather than just focusing on short-term financial gain. So focusing on this importance of value creation, then Chris, I wonder if we could ask you a question. We understand that you're in the process of implementing a management information system that focuses on this concept of wider value creation. Could you provide an overview of that process to date?
Yeah, thanks, Helen. And I suppose, yeah, I mean, reflecting on the question before in terms of where we are on that journey, we're just at the start of it. I've been in the post for 2 years now, and you know, I think in terms of our role, so we commission ambulance services on behalf of 7 health boards within Wales. So our kind of key customers, if you like, are 7 health boards. And the way ambulance services were managed was via target setting. So people may be familiar with, in the UK, the 8-minute target for ambulance to respond. So 75% of ambulances need to respond to what are classified as urgent or life-threatening calls within 8 minutes. So that was the main target that was kind of driving conversations with regards to management information. But I think then just taking that back and reflecting on the journey, reflecting on what I think integrated reporting could bring to this and that kind of broader value creation aspect, we started to explore how we could bring in wider sources of information that truly reflect the kind of broader performance elements of the ambulance service within to management information. So the first part of doing that was to set a strategic objective around value. And we set commissioning intentions, which are effectively strategic objectives. So one was around value-based healthcare, which is actually looking at the outcomes that are delivered for patients. And as part of then developing that, we needed to adopt a framework. And given kind of prior experience and knowledge of the integrated reporting framework, that seemed to offer the kind of breadth in terms of the 6 capitals that would allow us to have a framework that's kind of holistic and broad enough to account for the factors that influence quite a wide range of policy goals. And again, we're doing this within the context of a broad health and social care policy. Some specific elements within Wales include the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, which means we actually have to incorporate the Sustainable Development Principle into our decision making so that we're meeting the needs of the current generation without detriment to future generations. We also have other legislation like the socio-economic duty, which ensures that there's not a reduction of inequalities of outcome across populations. And we also have an overarching strategy of a healthier Wales. So in terms of a kind of framework, the integrated reporting framework offered us a kind of broad capitals, but then also the ability to have that kind of input, process, output, outcome model, which was really helpful in aligning that to what we have as a kind of 5-step process model for the ambulance service. So again, in terms of then, you know, journey and where we're on that, then you have to get people up to speed with actually what these frameworks are, what they are about, and also how they can use them and how they can help them. So a lot of the initial work was done around stakeholder engagement and just getting people up to speed in terms of, you know, how this could help them in terms of their decision making. And that was looking at a kind of broad range of stakeholders. I suppose one of the examples that we used to try and highlight that was looking at a heart failure pathway within healthcare. So this was looking at ambulance responses to cardiac arrest. They had come to us as a commissioner, and the ambulance service had come and put forward a proposal for how they were going to address heart failures in terms of an increase in the number of staff and the quality of staff in terms of trained leadership. So again, in the framework, that's looking at financial investment in improved human capital. And we were able to then kind of analyze that through the process and pathway to track what are the outcomes going to be for patients as a result of this. And I think what was helpful about the framework in terms of that is that it then allowed us to do some kind of gap analysis in terms of looking at actually some of the different capitals and their impacts. And one of the things that came through in terms of responses to that was actually the critical factors in responding to heart failure are actually the ability to be on the scene really quickly. So again, I mentioned the 8-minute target at the start. That's actually quite late. It needs to really be the first kind of couple of minutes in terms of response. And to get that level of response, that actually relies on having people in the community, members of the public who are trained in doing CPR. And it also relies on having access to defibrillators close by, so that they can actually respond to someone who they recognise is going into cardiac arrest or having a heart attack. So actually there, you're looking at investments in social capital in terms of training population, and also actually investment in public infrastructure in terms of putting defibrillators in as well. So I think, you know, it's being able to take the framework, look at it, explore with people, you know, how it can be used and how it's actually helpful, and then to have a pathway forward to actually start to try and implement these. And I think that the combination of doing that stakeholder engagement with the kind of case study approach has been really helpful in doing that.
Thank you, Chris. It's really helpful to kind of get your backing as to what drives kind of developing this internal kind of system, and just touching on the corporate purposes and aligning with strategy and focusing on the needs of stakeholders and kind of aligning it to an overall framework can be a really helpful step to starting out on the journey. Another part that's also quite important in determining what's important is the materiality assessment, incorporating the principles of double materiality. And to explore this in a little bit more depth, if we could turn to you, Hendrik. I understand that CLP carries out regular materiality assessments to determine what's important to the organisation from a sustainability perspective. Could you describe how you go around this process and how your material issues drive your strategy and approach?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks very much for having us join here today as well. I just sort of wanted to highlight a few points around materiality. And well, first of all, we don't have all the answers here at CLP either. This is an evolving process. The double materiality approach in particular is a fairly new concept that corporates or organizations are being asked to deploy. What we have done in the past is really focus on ESG, sustainability more broadly, and which are the key issues that are facing CLP from the perspective of mega trends. What are the big pieces outside CLP that are shaping our business, the realities that we are operating in? And that could be anything related to climate change, to our customers, to stakeholder expectations, regulators, any sort of key trends that are shaping the electric utility sector more broadly. But specifically then, what does that mean for our operations here in Hong Kong, in mainland China, across India, Australia, and the various different types of assets that we deploy to generate electricity. So from that bigger picture approach, we really then get to the point of identifying key topics that we should be managing. And what we've done in the past is have sort of a strategic discussion in our sustainability report on 4 key themes as we identified in our last report on climate change. Obviously, that's very important to an electric utility that is still operating thermal assets, but also technology and the changing technology landscape and what we need to do to be ready to tackle the energy transition and really get more efficient in our own operations, and what sort of innovations can we deploy to cater to our customer needs. cybersecurity came up, and not just from a customer perspective, from a data management perspective, but specifically, obviously, looking at the types of assets that we have. It's really about looking at cybersecurity from not being hacked as an organization. So, we don't want to have anyone taking control of our power plants, and how do we manage those risks? What do we deploy in practice to communicate to our stakeholders that we are indeed in control of this risk as much as we can, that we have the right management approach and the right systems in place. And underpinning all that, what came out in our materiality assessment is the workforce piece. So having the right people in place to make sure that we can deal with all these extraneous variables, if you like, these big pieces that are pushing us beyond just running a power plant, but managing climate change, managing technology changes. It's a constantly evolving field, right? Now that's sort of what we then put into our sustainability report in a fairly succinct manner, we hope, and try to highlight that to our stakeholders. But if you then take that further now, and especially considering what the likes of ISSB are advocating, but also EFRAG and the European Union in terms of deploying a double materiality concept, what is it from this ESG landscape that I just described as an example for CLP? What is it that investors really care about? What is really pushing enterprise value here in a positive or a negative way? And what is it that other stakeholders care about? Our customers, the communities where we operate, our employees. Where do we have impact as an organization, both positive and negative? And so what we've done this process over a number of years now, starting with the big picture megatrends approach and trying to narrow that down to how that is relevant to us. And stakeholder engagement is a part of it, but really it's doing your research, it's doing your homework, it's understanding your own industry and understanding these trends and how they're shaping you as a business. And you can get that information from stakeholders, or you can literally do some desktop analysis to some extent. But then beyond that, it's really also about engaging our internal experts about what's shaping them and their day-to-day business in terms of operating power plants, or engaging with our customers. What are the key issues there? So that's part of the process. And then we bring that up to the senior management team for their deliberation, for their, as this is the C-suite that I'm talking about, the C-suite of CLP Holdings. We engage them in a workshop to work through all these issues, these topics, and what is it that is then most material to the CLP business? How do we then translate that into a report? That's then my job as a function running group sustainability. But more importantly, or similarly important, how do we then utilize this materiality assessment to make sure that our risk register is up to date as well? So I think the materiality assessment isn't just an annual disclosure exercise. It is really something that we should take to heart as an organization and understand whether we are indeed tracking these risks and managing them, and have systems in place and have accountability in place so that these issues don't go out of bounds. Now, so this is sort of what we're at the moment, but this double materiality approach isn't making it any simpler. It is making it simpler from the perspective of, okay, what's material to the investors? Let's put that in the annual report. So we're working now with the annual report team based on our materiality assessment output of how do we translate that into the capitals and integrated reporting framework. And at the same time, perhaps refocusing our sustainability report, which was previously much more strategic, to have a focus on what impacts do we have on our stakeholders and how we are minimizing or optimizing those impacts. This is work in progress. I'm literally reporting the outcome of our 2021 materiality assessment and our proposed approach to our board level sustainability committee on Thursday this week for their sign off and for their sort of blessing in terms of, yes, this makes sense for us as an organization in terms of the key issues that we have to deal with and that should be managed, but also then how do we split that in terms of audience between investors on one side and more broadly other stakeholders perhaps on the other side.
Thank you, Hendrik. And it's really interesting to hear how materiality really underpins a lot of reporting and is kind of a core area where organizations really need to get to grips with this concept of double materiality. And you touched on the importance of also kind of tailoring reporting and management information to stakeholders. And Chris, you discussed how you kind of have undertaken quite a lot of stakeholder engagement to drive your internal reporting systems and the outputs. I wonder if you could also discuss how you engage with stakeholders to ensure that that information that you collate will be decision useful for them.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. So yeah, I as said, the kind of a lot of the work in the kind of first phase of this approach was around that stakeholder engagement and having that two-way conversation really in terms of one, understanding what their needs are, and two, also kind of communicating and explaining the framework and how the integrated reporting framework can actually help and benefit in terms of making the information decision useful. And we went through a very broad range of stakeholders. So that has included Audit Wales, Welsh Government policy leads, the value-based healthcare team, the ambulance service itself, Digital Health and Care Wales from an information and digital data perspective, and also then the health boards as the commissioners in terms of being a kind of key customers, if you like. And I think the focus of those conversations has been at the board level, again, to make sure that people at that kind of top level, so it is in that respect more of the strategic approach in terms of integrating value into strategic commissioning intentions and getting that conversation going at board level. But it's also then understanding that you understand who your target audience is and what they need in order to make good decisions. And again, in terms of what we're talking about with the provision of ambulance services to a national population, that's quite challenging, and there is quite a wide range of factors involved in doing that. But I suppose, I mean, just picking up on the link back to the guide, then this is one of the aspects that we actually try to build into the guide, because you know when you're producing management information, there's a lot of parallels to actually, you know, software development approaches and the use of iterative approaches and agile, and certainly the kind of customer development type approaches are really, really relevant. So it's absolutely about listening to what the needs are of your customer in terms of provision of that management information, and being agile and iterative in your approach to actually going back, reflecting, taking that information back, doing another development of a report, or you know what we're working on at the moment is trying to develop a board report that integrates all those different sources of value for the ambulance services, and then going back to make sure that it's actually designed, tailored to the way that they can understand it as well. And particularly when you integrate financial information alongside some of the social and environmental information, then actually I think the aspects of visualization, etc., are really, really helpful to try to integrate that information and communicate it in a way that's helpful and decision useful.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's really important to kind of think about who's going to be using that information, and which will often drive kind of where and how you report, along with those external kind of reporting requirements, which ultimately these management information reports might feed into. Internal assurance is also really important to ensure that to reduce the risk of material misstatement. Sustainability information can be kind of harder to collect and might not be as robust as financial information, and focusing on kind of creating stronger processes around that is a really important step in developing your management information systems. And Joanne, a key issue in obtaining data for reporting can be around that quality of data. What would you say are the key challenges for businesses around obtaining and strengthening assurance processes around that data collection?
Yeah, Helen, thank you. I think one of the challenges is to know what objectives you're trying to solve for in designing your management information system. So, you know, very much as Hendrik and Chris have said this morning, you know, you need to have your objectives in mind. Who will be the user of the information? What are their expectations on the quality of the data? You know, if for those who have very strongly ESG investors on their shareholder list, you're going to find that the investors really prize, you know, high quality data for their decision making, and therefore one needs to be really sure about the quality of the data, either through internal assurance or external assurance or some combination of those two. So having the end in mind is really important, and not assuming that you can make those calls about data quality internally only. Secondly, perhaps don't assume that the data that the organization collects you know, from at the operations level is in fact inherently reliable. We all know from running management information systems that the whole journey of building reliable data for internal and external reporting is fraught with difficulty, particularly as you're dealing with people who often don't understand the reporting process or its objectives. And so it's really important to design internal assurance processes that really, you know, build the internal reliability of the data. Through, for example, applying the 3 lines of defense model. Very strong management controls are important from the get-go, and then also deciding what other layers of internal assurance you want to apply to build the integrity of the data that underpins sustainability reporting. You know, often organizations will default to thinking that if you have external assurance on the sustainability data, that will fix any risk of misstatement. And of course, we all know that, first of all, when you adopt that approach, the external assurance process becomes very expensive because of the inherent lack of reliability potentially of the data. And so very important to build strong internal assurance and then overlay external assurance on the most material information with your investors and other users in mind. Remember that when we deal with financial information that's materially misstated is essentially, in some cases, fraud on the market. And as regulators become more intent and focused on sustainability information as part of informing investors to be able to make good investment decisions, you know, it's not unforeseeable that sustainability data will assume the same level of importance from a market regulation perspective down the line. So very important to get this in place now. Another challenge is not to sort of, you know, often organizations, for all the right reasons, of course, will try to balance effectiveness of management information systems with costs and resources. And, you know, you really need to think through, as you do this process, think through where you're going to put your resources to have most bang for their buck. What you don't want to do is say, well, we can't afford to implement any systems or processes now, or we can't afford to invest in those information systems add-ons that the ERP may require, whatever it is, and postpone this so that the organization gets used to working with data that isn't all that reliable and, you know, making fixes around that. You don't want that. You want it to be working in the same way as your material financial information. And these are some of the challenges, Helen.
I've agreed. And Hendrik, ensuring a robust governance framework around kind of the data management, data collection and systems can be a really important step in supporting good information. Can you outline the importance of this within CLP?
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree with what Joanne just highlighted here for us. If you would just, you know, take the view of data disclosure and look at non-financial data versus financial data, as a listed entity, you are disclosing information to the market, whether it's financial or not, or non-financial. And non-financial could be CO2 emissions, in, you know, in the case of CLP. And you go above and beyond to make sure that your financials are correct and audited and very much accurate. And then you put out a figure that says, let's say 85,000 tons of CO2 was my scope 1 emissions. Okay, if you are an analyst and you look at that as an electric utility with the sort of plants that CLP would have, that's ridiculous, that's impossible. Oh, sorry, you made a mistake. It should have been 85 1,000 million tons or whatnot. Like, you know, we screwed up a couple of digits. How bad? Sorry. That's not good. Why would there be any sort of acceptance that as a listed entity, you can screw up your digits or disclose incorrect information about your operations for the calendar year? I think having these sort of systems in place to make sure that these mistakes don't happen are essential. Having systems in place that allow for external assurance to come through to make sure that those sort of issues that are most material from an investor perspective, in particular ESG material, and the metrics that are associated with that are correct, is, in my mind, essential. Otherwise, you're going down the track of misleading your investors. Why would there be any reason that your financials or your non-financials are not at the same level as your financials in terms of data disclosure? So the systems we put in place, you know, it's work in progress. We have, and I have this nice little sticky note that, because this question comes up frequently. For 2020, we have 534 non-financial metrics that we disclosed in our reporting suite. But only 85 of those are assured. Those are the most material, the ones that are most relevant, the ones where we have compliance or regulatory, not issues, but we need to make sure that we meet certain regulatory requirements. So those are the ones that are sort of core. Why don't we have all of them? Well, every one of those KPIs requires a manual, a description of who is responsible for collecting this information from the ground up. So from various plants, how does that feed into the group level? How does that get aggregated? What's the methodology? And then beyond that, we look at these metrics to really make sure that what we bring to the market here, that there's no misstatement of information, right? So yeah, no, I think it's really quite important that we have clear guidance internally as well, and from a data collection process. It's really about writing an entire manual for 534 metrics that we need to have. But then if you get a third party to come on board to look at all of these, the costs are prohibitive at this point. Or just covering the 85 is the very, you know, from a sustainability budget perspective, a relatively expensive exercise. We don't spend quite as much as we do on our financials just yet. But when you get the likes of the Big Four or these sort of big auditing accounting firms involved, you can imagine what we're looking at. But it is just that important.
Joanne, I see you have your hand raised. If you want to jump in.
Thank you very much. Hendrik's words there triggered a thought in my mind, and that is that these days the sustainability reporting frameworks, or the non-financial reporting frameworks, including those that are regulatory based, are asking the corporate reporter to disclose their approach to assurance as well. So it's very important, building on what Hendrik said, that the type and level of assurance that is being applied to the non-financial information reported publicly and non-publicly needs to be disclosed in your non-financial report, or in your strategic report, or in your integrated report. And that's very important, so that investors don't incorrectly assume that you have strong internal assurance. Obviously, they can see if you've got external assurance or not. But the key thing is to actually yourselves disclose, as corporates disclose, you know, what that assurance looks like, to enable the investor to have a heads up about that.
Thank you, Joanne. And there's another point, so kind of historic audited information, which we tend to see financial systems can be have a well-trodden path for assurance. But what about kind of this future uncertainty? And Chris, I wondered if you could touch upon the more kind of uncertain data within management information systems and how you go about kind of assessing that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Helen. Yeah, so I mean, I suppose even some of the ones that we look at as more certain, like we've just done an investment in frontline service development for ambulance services, and so that relies heavily on kind of headcount and whole time equivalent data. You know, even getting that right sometimes can be a challenge in terms of the basic operations around collective management information, as Joanne touched upon earlier. But then building on that, then we have challenges as well around how we actually obtain and utilize outcomes data for patients for ambulance services and integrate that data into our management decision making. And sometimes, you know, that data is not robust, or equally it's not available. So we think about again a kind of pathway of someone who needs an emergency response, is picked up by an ambulance, transported to the front door of a hospital, but effectively that's where the ambulance service then stops. But the patient outcome doesn't stop there, because the patient then goes into an emergency department. Within emergency departments, we know that actually over 50% of clinical conditions recorded in emergency departments are given as unspecified or unknown. So that's a real challenge in terms of looking at the effectiveness of your healthcare response, if actually people are transported to the front door of a hospital, but then actually on going into that hospital, we don't actually know what the outcome of the patient was. And I think equally to that, then we've got the broader aspects around systemic challenges that influence ambulance service delivery. So I touched upon the investment in frontline services. That was developed based on some modelling that we did around population demand and the capacity required to respond to that demand. And as part of doing that modelling, we need to integrate kind of quite a wide range and complex set of factors, and that includes the wider health system. So looking at hospital bed capacity and seeing whether people are actually able to flow out of and be discharged from hospital, which again helps to create that flow through from the front door into the hospital and then out again in terms of discharge. Social care arrangements also impact that. So again, the availability of care packages, etc., for people to be able to go into that, and also then looking at population need and risk factors. So within Wales, we've got, for example, an increasing elderly and frail population, and there are also other risk factors in terms of looking at obesity and the link between that and cardiac arrest. So as part of our kind of approach to trying to manage some of those uncertainties, we've actually been working with a third party who help us to do some of this modelling. And it's, again, touching upon the stakeholder engagement piece, really important for us that we factor in those different views and different needs, but also then bring in some of the expertise who have experience and folks of doing that kind of modelling work, and try to be able to draw all of that kind of disparate and uncertain information together to be able to come to some sort of view and decision in terms of moving forward.
Thank you, Chris. So in order to make sure we've got some time for the Q&A, I better move on to some polls. So I thank you so much for your input. Just as a reminder to the audience, if you have any questions, then please do drop them into the chat box and we'll try and address them after our few polls. So just for the first poll, just to cover some of the information that we've talked about today, how does an IMI help business leaders? Does it contribute to de-risking the business, including for material sustainability related factors? Align management decision making with wider strategy, including sustainability related objectives? And ensure focus value and long-term value creation rather than short-term financial gain, or all of the above? It's good to see that most people are selecting all three options, and there's multiple ways that IMI can help business leaders, so it's great to see your responses there. On to the second poll. So what drives the information you include in your IMI? Can this be key stakeholder information requirements, your sustainability objectives, overall corporate strategy, materiality assessments, or all of the above, and select all if you think all of the above. And if you can see the polls there, most people think that the top three are important and materiality assessments are close second, but it's important to highlight that materiality assessments are very important to driving kind of integrated management information and your wider reporting. And just for the final poll, what main factors should drive management's decision on the type and level of assurance to be applied to IMI? Relative materiality of data and information, the organization's existing approach to internal assurance, sophistication and reach of the organization's current internal audit resources, or resource prioritization and related implementation costs. And again, the majority of these answers apply, but it is important to consider your assurance resource prioritization and cost as a kind of secondary consideration, not your primary consideration. Thank you so much for participating in the polls. If we move on to the audience Q&A, and just if anybody has any questions, please do feel free to drop them into the chat box. But perhaps starting it with the first question to you, Chris. Do you think that we should involve citizens in designing these KPIs and assurance?
Thanks, Helen, and thanks, Nigel, for the question. So I think citizens need to be involved in the service design because I think that we need to understand the citizens' needs in terms of what and in our case, what the ambulance service needs to deliver in order to meet those citizens' needs. And I think also there needs to be data available to citizens on performance that they can understand. So I think in that respect, we need to have citizen involvement and engagement. In terms of KPIs specifically, for me, that's part of the commissioner and provider responsibility, because once you've assessed what those needs are as part of the service design, it then needs to be integrated into a commissioning and provider model in terms of having people accountable for those KPIs. And in terms of the assurance factor then, I mean, really that's for experts rather than citizens. So again, in terms of assurance of data, I'd be looking to clinicians to assure my patient safety data. I'd be looking at IT experts for my cybersecurity data. I'd be looking at accountants to be able to assure my financial data. So really, I think there's kind of different approach. But if you start from that need perspective, then citizens absolutely need to be engaged within that. But then I think, you know, as you go and move up through to KPIs, it's about accountability. And then for assurance, it's about making sure you have the right expertise to assure the data that is being used.
Thank you, Chris. And another question on kind of assessing what kind of ESG information is price sensitive to investors. Hendrik, do you have any thoughts on considering kind of the importance of price sensitivity on the information that you report?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And as we were going through this process just in the last few weeks or months, and we tried to distill which ESG risk factors or opportunities have an influence on enterprise value, and which one of those are most important and most material. and the way we go through this process of engaging external sources, key trends, mega trends, external experts, internal experts, and then ultimately our own senior management team and board, it's a judgment call at this point. That's where we are. So we came up with a funny name for it. I'm not sure if you guys would find this funny, but it's really a qualitative financial materiality, if that makes any sense at this point. Yeah, that's where we're at. I think we're looking for more guidance from the accountants of how to quantify this more specifically. And that's, as it is at the moment, an evolving field. And if you or anyone else has insights on how to go about doing that, we're all ears. But I don't think that's unusual at this point. But Joanne, I think you might have some additional thoughts on this.
I think you're on mute, Joanne.
I'm on mute. That's right. Sorry about that. Hendrik, you're on the button. This is a developing space. It's not an easy question to answer, but I think we can take a leaf out of the practice that underpins determining materiality and materiality mapping. So, you know, from an information disclosure governance point of view, one of the key steps that you can take to understand what the market expects of information, you know, and what may be price sensitive is to conduct good stakeholder engagement and stakeholder analysis. So by doing an internal analysis and engaging stakeholders, actually, you know, investors and other stakeholders to say, you know, what is the information you're using most and how are you using it in your valuations? You develop an internal understanding of what is likely to be price sensitive. So one can take that step to bridge that gap. And then that feeds into your materiality mappings. It will inform your materiality mappings. And therefore, the most material information is always, you know, the assumption is that it's going to drive decision making and therefore it's price sensitive. And then I think, you know, you're right, Hendrik, the frameworks are developing. The frameworks that are coming through the ISSB will probably tell us some of these things in a way that, you know, removes uncertainty to some extent anyway. But I think for now, as you say, one has to, you know, take these steps using your own efforts, really.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Hendrik. And Joanne, we have a question as well on kind of the importance of ESG for small companies. There's a lot of focus on reporting for larger organizations and listed entities, but I wonder if you could kind of touch on the importance for a smaller organization of reporting and managing ESG.
Yeah, I think the key way to sort of tackle this question now, Helen, is to understand that ESG at its most, you know, foundational conceptual format is talking about long-term sustainability and long-term value. And that's a concept that actually applies whether you're a big listed company on NASDAQ or whether you're a charity in Norfolk or, you know, whatever it is. The thinking behind ESG is how do you drive long-term value and how do you remain sustainable and relevant to your stakeholders over the longer term. And therefore, whether you're NASDAQ or whether you're a small charity or a club or a small private sector business, the ESG principles remain the same. And that is that you have to tell your stakeholders and yourselves for the benefit of your own decision making. You need to inform yourselves and inform your stakeholders on what is driving your long-term sustainability, including the ESG risk and opportunity factors that are typical or associated with your business or your enterprise or your organization. So yes, it is equally relevant. It's just thinking about it differently. I do appreciate that with Hendrik and Chris on the call, you know, these are organizations with many stakeholders, many external stakeholders that have strong voices and that have big expectations of what ESG looks like for their organizations and how they tell their stakeholders about that. But the same principles apply at private sector level and also at small, you know, not-for-profit entity level as well.
Thank you, Joanne. So that brings us to the end of the Q&A, and I just want to thank our speakers once again before I hand over to Nadine. So many thanks to Hendrik, Chris and Joanne for sharing your insights with us today. So Nadine, if I hand over to you to take us through the A4S resources, which may help to for our organisation to put some of these practices in place.
Apologies, technical hiccup. So thank you, Hendrik, and Chris and John for leading us through this really interesting discussion today. So just to let everyone know, in the usual fashion, after this webinar, you will receive a detailed email with all the various resources, which include links to really important documents that have been mentioned throughout the webinar, such as the A4S guide to management information, as well as, for example, more information on the recent launch of ISSB, which has been mentioned by Hendrik. And these various documents will really help you further understand how you can put some of the learnings today into action and maybe make it less of an abstract concept and more something you understand how to take a first step into. And just to let you know, the recording of today's webinar will also be made available in a week's time. So in case there's anything you would like to review, we will send you an email once it's available so you can further go through that. Just to let you know, we are running these webinars regularly. So in the new year, we will be running one on enhancing investor engagement. So we highly encourage you to register for that and to join us again for a very interesting discussion. And again, I just want to thank Chris and Hendrik and Joanne today for giving us insights on integrating environment and social considerations into management information processes. And we would obviously like to hear how you found today's session, if you found it relevant and insightful. So we're just running a poll to get your feedback. And otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you soon.